Nathan Carter first saw the woman in the Navy coat kneeling beside a crying child beneath the departure screens at John F. Kennedy International Airport. But what stopped him was not her kindness. It was the sentence she whispered while returning a stuffed rabbit to the little girl's trembling hands, a sentence Nathan had heard only once before, beside his father's hospital bed 3 years earlier. "People find their way home when someone refuses to stop looking," she said, unaware that the billionaire standing 10 feet away had just forgotten how to breathe. Nathan abandoned the merger documents glowing on his tablet and moved through the crowd as airport security announcements echoed across Terminal 4. Because Benjamin Carter had spoken those exact words hours before his death. Before Nathan could ask who she was, the woman glanced toward him with a flash of recognition she quickly concealed, then guided the child's frantic mother through the crowd, as though their reunion mattered more than whatever secret had brought her there. By the time Nathan reached them, the woman had already turned away, leaving him with a question that would soon threaten his company, his family, and every certainty he had inherited. The little girl's mother thanked them through tears, while Nathan watched the stranger adjust the blue scarf around her neck and move toward a quiet cafe overlooking the runways. He followed without deciding to, telling himself that coincidence deserved an explanation, although some instinct warned him that the woman had been expecting him long before his private aircraft developed its conveniently timed mechanical failure. She introduced herself as Zoe Bennett, a pediatric nurse from Baltimore, and accepted a cup of tea only after Nathan promised he was not attempting to interrogate her. Her smile was warm, but her answers were carefully measured, especially when he mentioned Benjamin Carter and repeated the sentence she had spoken to the child. Zoe lowered her eyes toward the runway, then said that kind words rarely belong to one person, although the slight tension in her fingers suggested she knew precisely where Nathan had heard them. Their conversation drifted toward childhood books, exhausted parents, and the strange loneliness of airports, yet Nathan sensed an invisible boundary whenever he asked why she had come to New York without luggage or a boarding pass. For nearly 40 minutes, Zoe treated Nathan as an ordinary man who had missed breakfast and carried too much responsibility in his shoulders, never mentioning Carter Global or the fortune attached to his surname. Nathan found himself confessing that his father had died before they repaired years of emotional distance, while Zoe admitted that her own mother had spent her final months waiting for a conversation that someone powerful had repeatedly prevented. Before Nathan could ask whether those unfinished conversations were connected, Zoe noticed two men in dark coats entering the cafe and immediately became still. She placed cash beneath her cup, told Nathan that meeting him had answered one important question, then stood as a boarding announcement covered the sound of her final words. Nathan caught only part of the sentence, something about his father protecting the wrong person, before Zoe disappeared into the terminal crowd with one of the men following several yards behind. Nathan pursued them through the concourse, but a temporary security closure divided the corridor, and when he reached the opposite side, both Zoe and the stranger had vanished. The airport police found no evidence of an abduction, and security footage showed Zoe leaving the cafe alone before every available camera lost her near an employee-only passage. Nathan rejected the suggestion that she had staged the encounter for attention, because she had never asked for his money, his assistance, or even his telephone number. On the chair beside her empty cup, he discovered the blue scarf she had been wearing, folded with deliberate care rather than forgotten in haste. A narrow seam inside the lining had been opened and stitched closed again, concealing a brass luggage key and a small card bearing the number 417. On the back, written in blue ink, were 9 words that transformed his curiosity into a threat he could no longer ignore. "Your father did not die before telling the truth." Nathan carried the scarf directly to Daniel Brooks, Carter Global's longtime chief of staff, and the only man who had stood beside Benjamin through the company's most difficult years. Daniel examined the key beneath the desk lamp, then claimed he had never seen it, although Nathan noticed the color leave his face before he finished speaking. The number corresponded to an abandoned luggage storage system once operated beneath Terminal 4, but airport records showed Locker 417 had been sealed after a security renovation almost 4 years earlier. When Nathan asked why his father would hide anything inside an airport locker, Daniel advised him to forget Zoe Bennett and return to the London acquisition before shareholders interpreted his absence as instability. Nathan had heard Daniel challenge reckless decisions for 15 years, yet he had never heard fear disguised as practicality so poorly. That evening, Nathan used his influence to gain supervised access to the decommissioned storage corridor, where Locker 417 opened with the brass key and revealed a single envelope bearing Benjamin Carter's handwriting. Inside was not a confession, but a photograph of Benjamin standing beside a younger black woman outside St. Margaret Children's Hospital in Baltimore, their expressions marked by trust rather than romance. The woman's name, Evelyn Bennett, was written beneath the image, followed by a date 19 years earlier and a warning Nathan could not interpret. If Richard learns she kept the original agreement, he will destroy her daughter before he loses the foundation. Nathan's uncle Richard had served as Carter Global's vice chairman for decades, presenting himself as the loyal younger brother who had protected the company while Benjamin battled illness. Before Nathan could absorb the accusation, his telephone rang from a blocked number, and Zoe's voice reached him through uneven breathing. She told him not to trust anyone who claimed the photograph proved everything, because the image was only the bait Benjamin expected Richard to find. Then a door slammed somewhere near her, the line went dead, and Nathan realized Zoe had not vanished to protect a secret from him. She had vanished because someone else had already begun hunting it. Nathan remained inside the abandoned corridor until airport security demanded that he leave, staring at the photograph while Zoe's interrupted warning replayed in his mind with increasing urgency. Daniel urged him to contact federal authorities, but Nathan refused to expose Zoe's location through a report that might reach Richard's attorneys before any investigator understood what they were protecting. Instead, he ordered Daniel to trace the blocked call and instructed Carter Global's general counsel to review every charitable transaction connected to Benjamin during the final 5 years of his life. Daniel complied, yet his hesitation sharpened Nathan's suspicion that the chief of staff knew more than he admitted. Before dawn, the call trace produced only a relay tower outside Baltimore, while the internal review uncovered something stranger. Benjamin had transferred nearly $2 billion into an independent medical foundation 18 months before his death, but the final controlling agreement had never been filed. Nathan traveled to St. Margaret Children's Hospital without notifying Richard, carrying the scarf beneath his coat and the photograph inside a locked portfolio. The nursing director, Margaret Ellis, recognized Evelyn immediately and explained that she had coordinated community health programs for nearly 25 years before dying from cancer. Zoe had followed her into pediatric nursing, but she resigned the morning after meeting Nathan at the airport, leaving behind no forwarding address and refusing a generous retention offer. Margaret denied knowing anything about a missing trust agreement until Nathan showed her Benjamin's warning, at which point she closed her office door and admitted that Evelyn had once accused a Carter representative of intercepting charitable correspondence. The hospital had nearly lost a major pediatric expansion because promised funds repeatedly disappeared between approval and delivery, yet Benjamin eventually restored every dollar through personal accounts. Evelyn believed someone inside his company was exploiting vulnerable hospitals to move money through private partnerships, but she refused to make public allegations without documents that would survive legal scrutiny. Margaret led Nathan to an archive room containing decades of donor records, where Benjamin's name appeared beside Evelyn's across hundreds of programs that had never carried either person's name. Their letters revealed a disciplined friendship grounded in service, accountability, and repeated frustration with delays neither of them could explain. Nathan felt ashamed that he had mistaken his father's reserve for emotional emptiness, because these pages exposed a man who had spent years quietly repairing damage created inside his own family. Among the files, Nathan found copies of canceled meetings bearing Daniel Brooks's initials, including 3 appointments Benjamin had attempted to schedule with Evelyn during the final month of his life. When Nathan confronted Daniel by telephone, the chief of staff insisted Benjamin had been too ill to travel and had personally authorized every cancellation. Margaret, however, produced a voicemail in which Benjamin stated that Daniel had been instructed to arrange the meeting immediately, proving that at least one of them was lying. The contradiction forced Nathan to consider an explanation he resisted more strongly than Richard's betrayal. Daniel had been his mentor after Benjamin's death, the man who taught him how to withstand hostile investors without allowing anger to make decisions. If Daniel had intercepted those meetings, then Zoe's warning about trusting the wrong person might reach far deeper than Nathan wanted to believe. Margaret interrupted his thoughts by revealing a sealed personnel packet Zoe had left behind, addressed to Nathan but protected by instructions requiring proof that he had found Evelyn's photograph independently. Inside, Zoe explained that she had spent nearly 2 years volunteering at Terminal 4 because Benjamin's final letter predicted Nathan would pass through during an unexpected travel disruption. She had never known the date, and she had refused to approach him directly because Evelyn believed character could not be tested through an arranged meeting. Zoe needed to see whether Nathan would interrupt his own plans to help someone powerless, and the lost child had provided an answer neither of them could manufacture. The letter also revealed why Zoe had fled the cafe. She had recognized one of Richard's private investigators, a former police officer who had followed her since she began reviewing Evelyn's records. Zoe feared Nathan would dismiss her as manipulative if armed men appeared minutes after their first conversation, so she left the scarf and used the employee passage to draw the investigator away. Her final instruction directed Nathan toward a legal aid clinic in Annapolis, where an attorney named Samuel Price had preserved documents Evelyn considered too dangerous to store at the hospital. Nathan drove there immediately, accompanied only by a private security specialist who had no connection to Carter Global. Samuel welcomed him with visible reluctance and admitted that Evelyn had entrusted him with copies of financial ledgers documenting charitable funds redirected into limited partnerships associated with Richard. The originals, however, had disappeared from a courthouse evidence vault 6 months after Benjamin's death. Samuel believed the theft had been designed to make Evelyn appear mistaken if she ever spoke publicly, although she had anticipated that possibility and created an independent chain of verification. Each ledger entry corresponded to a patient assistance payment, hospital invoice, or property purchase that could be proven without relying on the missing documents. What Evelyn lacked was the authority to compel records from Carter Global's private investment division, authority Benjamin intended to grant through the unsigned foundation agreement. Samuel then showed Nathan a security photograph taken outside his clinic 2 days earlier, capturing Zoe entering a sedan beside a gray-haired man Nathan immediately recognized. Daniel Brooks stood beside the open rear door, one hand resting gently on Zoe's shoulder, and nothing in her expression suggested she had been forced inside. Nathan's anger arrived before reason, because Daniel had denied knowing her only hours earlier. Samuel handed him a note Zoe had left after the photograph was taken, and its final sentence made the betrayal even harder to understand. "Daniel is the only reason I am still alive, but he is also the reason your father died believing he had failed." Nathan read Zoe's message 3 times before calling Daniel, but the chief of staff's telephone had already been disconnected, and his Manhattan apartment stood empty when private security arrived. Samuel urged Nathan to slow down, explaining that Evelyn had trusted Daniel enough to send him medical updates during Benjamin's illness, even while suspecting that someone inside Carter Global had intercepted their correspondence. The conflicting evidence suggested Daniel had protected Zoe while concealing decisions that caused lasting harm, which meant Nathan needed an explanation rather than another assumption. Samuel provided the address of a small farmhouse near Chesapeake Bay that Evelyn had once used for confidential meetings, warning that Daniel might expect Nathan to find it. When Nathan arrived after sunset, he saw Zoe through an uncovered window, seated across from Daniel at a kitchen table covered with hospital invoices and handwritten timelines. Neither appeared surprised when Nathan entered, but Zoe's relief vanished as soon as she saw the accusation in his face. Daniel admitted knowing Zoe since Evelyn's final year, then asked Nathan to listen before deciding whether loyalty and honesty had always meant the same thing inside the Carter family. During Benjamin's illness, Richard threatened to freeze operating funds for 6 hospitals unless Benjamin abandoned the investigation into the diverted foundation assets. Benjamin could have exposed his brother immediately, but litigation would have locked every disputed account, while pediatric programs collapsed beneath legal uncertainty. Evelyn proposed a slower strategy that preserved medical funding, duplicated the evidence, and delayed public confrontation until the foundation could operate independently from Carter Global. Daniel became their intermediary because Richard monitored Benjamin's communications, yet his role required him to cancel real meetings, destroy traceable correspondence, and allow Evelyn to believe Benjamin had chosen silence. He had protected the plan so completely that both Benjamin and Evelyn died without knowing whether the other understood the sacrifice. Nathan demanded to know why Daniel had allowed his father to carry that regret into his final days, and Daniel answered with a truth less dramatic than betrayal, but more painful. Benjamin's heart condition had deteriorated rapidly, and Evelyn's cancer had returned at the same time, leaving each of them convinced the other should be spared one final burden. Daniel delivered reassuring messages in both directions, believing compassion justified softening what neither friend could repair. When Benjamin died unexpectedly after a surgical complication, Daniel lost the opportunity to confess that Evelyn had preserved the original agreement. Evelyn died 5 months later, still uncertain whether Benjamin had abandoned the foundation, and Zoe inherited not only the evidence but her mother's unresolved grief. Daniel's choice had saved the legal strategy, yet it had stolen the honest farewell both families deserved. Nathan understood why Zoe had written that Daniel kept her alive, while leaving Benjamin convinced he had failed. Zoe then explained that Richard's investigator had followed her from the airport because she possessed the only surviving copy of Evelyn's verification map, which connected each diverted dollar to a real hospital loss. Daniel intercepted her before the investigator could identify where she stored it, then moved her between trusted locations while searching for proof Richard could not dismiss as fabricated. She had not contacted Nathan because her meeting with him created the exact danger Benjamin hoped to delay until Nathan demonstrated independence from the company's internal structure. Nathan resisted the idea that everyone had been measuring his character without granting him the dignity of informed choice, and Zoe accepted his anger without defending herself. She admitted that honoring her mother had become an excuse to avoid building a life untouched by old promises. Waiting at the airport gave her purpose, but it also allowed grief to make every decision for her. Their honesty shifted the conflict from inherited suspicion toward a choice neither Benjamin nor Evelyn had been able to make. Nathan could protect Carter Global's market value by negotiating Richard's quiet resignation, or he could expose the scheme and risk months of public investigation that might frighten donors and destabilize hospitals. Zoe argued that secrecy had already consumed 2 families, yet she refused to support revenge disguised as justice. Daniel proposed a third path using the foundation's independent authority, but they still needed the original controlling agreement to prove the assets had legally left Richard's reach. Benjamin had concealed it in a place Richard would never search because accessing it required cooperation between Nathan and Evelyn's successor trustee. The location was hidden inside the blue scarf, not through another coded message, but within the embroidery itself. Under magnification, the decorative pattern formed a map of Baltimore's Inner Harbor, ending at Harbor Light Books, an independent store Evelyn had supported for years. Zoe remembered her mother donating medical memoirs there, while Daniel recognized the shop as the location where Benjamin and Evelyn first discussed creating a foundation beyond Carter family control. They reached the bookstore shortly before closing and found the owner, Ruth Alvarez, waiting beside a locked reading room. Ruth refused to release anything until Zoe stated, without coaching, what Evelyn believed money was meant to accomplish. Zoe answered that money should return choices to people who had been denied them, not purchase gratitude from those with fewer choices. Ruth opened the room and removed a weathered copy of The Little Prince from a glass cabinet, revealing a sealed legal document hidden inside its reinforced cover. The controlling agreement carried Benjamin's signature, Evelyn's signature, independent legal certification, and an unfilled line naming Evelyn's successor trustee. Zoe's appointment became valid only if she accepted freely after reviewing the foundation's responsibilities, meaning Richard could still challenge the agreement if she appeared coerced by Nathan. Before they could contact Samuel, Ruth noticed smoke spreading beneath the rear door, and the building's fire alarm failed to sound. Daniel moved toward the exit, while Nathan wrapped the document inside his coat. But Zoe opened a side window and recognized Richard's investigators standing across the alley. The man did not attempt to stop them as firefighters arrived, because destroying the bookstore had never been his only purpose. He raised his telephone, photographed Nathan escaping with the agreement, and sent Richard proof that the final document had been found. The fire damaged the bookstore's storage room, but left the reading area intact, and investigators quickly determined that an electrical panel had been deliberately overloaded. Ruth refused Nathan's offer to relocate her, insisting that fear became powerful only when decent people reorganized their lives around it. Her courage forced Nathan to confront the pattern surrounding his father's choices, because Benjamin had protected hospitals by accepting silence, while Richard learned that pressure produced obedience. Nathan authorized Samuel to notify federal financial investigators, but he delayed releasing the documents publicly until Zoe could decide whether she would accept the trusteeship. She asked for 24 hours, not because she feared Richard, but because every person around her seemed convinced that her mother's life should determine the shape of her own. Nathan wanted to persuade her, yet he recognized that turning inherited duty into another form of pressure would repeat the very harm they claimed to oppose. They returned to Baltimore under protection and spent the night inside an unused hospital residence where Evelyn had once stayed during outreach programs. Zoe found an old box containing nursing photographs, birthday cards from former patients, and a letter her mother had never sent. Evelyn wrote that service could become selfish when it required children to inherit unfinished battles, and she feared Zoe would confuse loyalty with surrendering her own future. The letter did not ask Zoe to accept the foundation. It asked her to decide whether the work still belonged to her, after grief no longer made the decision. Nathan read only the portion Zoe offered, then admitted that Carter Global had become his own inheritance, disguised as ambition. He had spent years proving he could preserve Benjamin's empire, without asking whether preserving it required becoming someone his father never intended him to be. Police entered before Pike could escape, but he swallowed a small memory card and refused to name anyone who hired him. The wooden box was not in his vehicle, and the location he gave for Daniel led officers to an abandoned storage room containing only Daniel's coat and a recording of his voice. Ethan believed the rescue had failed until Amara noticed that Daniel repeated the phrase "fresh batteries" 3 times during the recording, words that sounded unnatural, until she remembered the cassette player Benjamin had once kept in the study. Daniel was signaling that he had hidden something inside a battery compartment before being taken. Back at the estate, investigators recovered a tiny key from the player, which opened a safe deposit box registered under Benjamin's former assistant. Inside, they found copies of letters Evelyn had sent after Pennsylvania, each stamped as received by Caldwell Capital, despite every envelope later being returned to her unopened. Someone within the company had intercepted them, copied them, and created false postal markings to convince Evelyn that Benjamin had rejected her. One letter contained the first complete explanation of 9/17. Evelyn wrote that Benjamin had stopped the watch when a telephone rang inside the church, because the caller used a private Caldwell phrase known only to board members. Benjamin realized the person tracing him was not an outsider attempting robbery, but someone with access to family communications and company accounts. He placed preliminary evidence behind the watch casing, then gave the watch to Evelyn because she had no financial connection to the Caldwells and could not be discredited as a rival shareholder. Another letter described a second object, a strip of audio film hidden in the matching boxes, recording Richard admitting he redirected pension funds through shell companies to purchase controlling shares. The evidence would have destroyed him, but Benjamin hesitated because exposing the fraud immediately would also bankrupt hundreds of employees whose retirement accounts had been used without their knowledge. His silence had not been cowardice. It had been an attempt to recover the money before revealing the crime. The discovery complicated Ethan's judgment, because releasing incomplete records could trigger the same financial damage Benjamin had tried to prevent. Amara understood his fear, yet she challenged the assumption that truth and destruction were the only available choices. They could protect employees through an emergency fund, secure independent auditors, and disclose the evidence in stages, but only if Ethan stopped treating the company's reputation as more fragile than the people whose money had been stolen. Her words struck him, because Benjamin had made the same mistake from the opposite direction, protecting innocent workers while allowing Richard's silence to become institutional history. Ethan authorized Daniel's deputy to freeze transfers linked to the old shell companies and prepared a trust using his personal shares as temporary collateral. The decision could cost him control of Caldwell Capital, even if Richard were convicted, although for the first time, Ethan understood leadership as something larger than preserving his position. Near midnight, police traced Pike's disposable telephone to a private medical transport company owned through another layer of Richard's holdings. One vehicle had crossed the Hudson 2 hours earlier and entered a closed rehabilitation hospital in northern New Jersey, where Daniel was likely being held. Marcus recognized the company name from his own clinic statements, because the same corporation had recently purchased the rehabilitation network and denied coverage for his continued therapy. The connection revealed that Richard's fraud had never remained buried in old ledgers. It had evolved into modern businesses that profited by restricting care to people like Marcus. Amara no longer saw the mystery as her mother's unfinished promise, or Ethan's family shame. The same system that had forced Evelyn into silence now decided which patients recovered and which families became too exhausted to resist. As they prepared to leave for the hospital with police, Ethan received a live video call from Richard, who stood beside Daniel and held Evelyn's stolen box against his chest. Richard said he would exchange both at dawn, but only if Ethan signed away his voting shares before the board could learn why Benjamin had truly remained silent. Richard chose the abandoned rehabilitation hospital because its ownership structure placed the building behind 3 corporations and beyond the immediate authority of Caldwell Security, although state police obtained a warrant before dawn. Ethan agreed to the meeting while officers entered through a service tunnel identified by Marcus from an old architectural plan used across the clinic network. Amara refused to remain behind, arguing that Richard had spent decades assuming women without wealth could be frightened into surrendering what they protected. Ethan did not pretend he could guarantee her safety, which mattered more than another promise built from power, so they entered together carrying unsigned transfer documents and the real watch concealed beneath Amara's coat. Inside the hospital, empty therapy rooms stretched beneath failing fluorescent lights, their abandoned equipment revealing how easily profitable institutions discarded places once they stopped producing returns. Richard waited inside the hydrotherapy hall beside Daniel, whose wrists were bound but whose eyes remained alert. Evelyn's wooden box rested on a treatment table, damaged along one edge where someone had tried unsuccessfully to pry it open. Richard did not deny the fraud, because denial had become less useful than justification. He claimed Benjamin inherited a company too sentimental to survive, while Richard redirected dormant funds to acquire competitors, protect jobs, and build the empire Ethan later received without understanding its cost. The pension money had been returned within 5 years, he argued, and no employee ever knew enough to feel harmed. Benjamin's evidence threatened to collapse the company before the stolen funds could be replaced, which was why Richard intercepted Evelyn's letters and persuaded the family that Benjamin suffered a breakdown. He insisted Benjamin eventually accepted silence as the least destructive choice, then accused Ethan of exploiting old guilt to appear morally superior. Ethan almost believed the argument's shape, because the company had indeed grown during those years, yet Marcus asked the question Richard had avoided. If no one had been harmed, why had the clinic network recently denied treatment while transferring millions into executive bonuses controlled by the same shell companies? Richard's composure fractured for the first time, not from shame, but from irritation that someone he considered irrelevant had followed the money into the present. He admitted the medical network generated the cash required to maintain control after Ethan began reforming Caldwell governance, then dismissed therapy denials as actuarial decisions made by people who understood business. Amara quietly activated the recorder inside Marcus's telephone, although Richard noticed the movement and ordered Pike's remaining associate to take it. Daniel used the distraction to drive his chair into the man's knees, while officers entered through the service doors and ended the confrontation without gunfire. Richard attempted to destroy Evelyn's box by striking it against the tiled floor, but Amara caught it against her body, protecting the damaged wood, while Ethan restrained Richard until police secured his hands. The moment contained no triumph, only the exhausted silence of people realizing how much suffering one man had justified by renaming greed as stability. At the station, Richard's attorney argued that the hospital confession could be challenged because parts were recorded before officers announced their presence. The older evidence still mattered, but without the second box, they lacked the complete audio film Thomas Vale had designed to preserve. Daniel, bruised but conscious, explained that the missing desk drawer was not stolen for its contents. It had been taken because the drawer itself formed Benjamin's half of the mechanism. Police recovered it from Pike's warehouse, along with documents linking Richard to the threats, although the carved oak box inside remained sealed. Clara arrived from Bellwether and aligned Evelyn's damaged box with Benjamin's, placing the brass key from the cassette player through the matching circular marks beneath their bases. The two boxes opened inward like mirrored books, revealing a narrow spool of photographic sound film, several original pension ledgers, and one final envelope addressed jointly to Ethan and Evelyn. Benjamin's letter admitted that he had allowed fear to become a form of betrayal. He had intended to protect employees, yet every month of silence gave Richard more control and left Evelyn carrying danger she never chose. Benjamin wrote that he loved her, although he refused to turn that love into an excuse for abandoning his obligations as a husband, father, or employer. Their bond had not been an affair, but the intimacy of two people who recognized courage in each other during one terrifying night. He asked Evelyn to keep the evidence only until he created a lawful recovery plan, then failed to contact her after Richard threatened to expose fabricated claims that would destroy the church and discredit her nursing license. Benjamin spent years quietly restoring the pension accounts and building safeguards against another theft, yet shame prevented him from telling Ethan why integrity sometimes required public accountability rather than private repair. The final paragraph asked Ethan not to inherit his silence merely because he had inherited everything else. The sound film contained Richard's younger voice, directing an accountant to transfer pension money and instructing him to label Benjamin emotionally unstable if he resisted. More importantly, the recording captured Benjamin refusing to participate and warning that Evelyn possessed enough evidence to expose them. The proof established Richard's motive for every later action, while modern financial records tied the same shell network to the rehabilitation company and several fraudulent insurance denials. Ethan convened the board under independent legal supervision and presented a disclosure plan protecting employees, patients, and shareholders before releasing the evidence publicly. He placed his voting shares into a temporary trust, funded Marcus's clinic network through restitution rather than charity, and requested that the board suspend him until regulators completed their review. Several directors urged him to remain, but Ethan understood that accountability lost meaning when leaders exempted themselves from its inconvenience. Hours before the public meeting, Amara stood with Ethan on the estate balcony and asked whether he feared losing the company. He admitted that he feared discovering the company had only loved him while he could protect its version of history. Amara told him institutions did not love people, although people inside them sometimes chose loyalty, courage, or comfort. The lesson was deciding which one deserved to survive. Ethan looked at the watch, now running again, after Clara repaired its mechanism, and noticed the minute hand approaching 9:17. For 28 years, that time had represented the moment Benjamin became afraid. Tomorrow, it would mark the moment his son decided whether truth could become something other than another family performance. The public meeting began at 9:17, inside the Caldwell Auditorium, not because Ethan wanted symbolism, but because regulators, employees, patients, and shareholders deserved to hear the truth before markets opened. He stepped onto the stage without the silver watch, leaving it with Amara in the front row, because the object belonged to the person who had protected it, rather than the man whose name appeared on its case. Ethan described the pension theft, the intercepted letters, the false narrative surrounding Benjamin, and the modern rehabilitation network that continued extracting profit from vulnerable families. He did not present his father as a flawless victim, because Benjamin's courage during the fraud had been weakened by years of secrecy afterward. Protecting employees from immediate collapse had been honorable. Denying them the right to understand what endangered their future had not. Ethan accepted responsibility for leading an institution built partly upon that silence, even though he had not created the crime, and could have defended himself by claiming ignorance. Richard's attorney attempted to interrupt the presentation, but independent counsel introduced the restored recordings, original ledgers, contractor payments, hospital confession, and records showing current insurance denials tied to executive bonus transfers. Employees listened to Benjamin's voice refuse the scheme, then heard him confess that private repair could never replace public truth. The evidence produced no theatrical outburst, because betrayal often becomes most powerful when a room grows quiet enough for everyone to recognize what they once accepted. Several longtime directors resigned before the meeting ended, while others voted to establish a restitution fund using recovered assets, executive compensation, and part of Ethan's personal holdings. The board also transferred temporary leadership to an outside restructuring officer, preserving Caldwell capital without pretending continuity mattered more than reform. Ethan walked away from the position he had spent half his life preparing to hold, yet the loss felt cleaner than the security Richard had offered in exchange for silence. Outside the auditorium, reporters surrounded Amara and asked whether she and Ethan were romantically involved, whether Evelyn had manipulated Benjamin, and whether Marcus's treatment would now be financed by Caldwell money. Amara refused the story they wanted and gave them the one that mattered. Her mother had protected evidence because a frightened man trusted her character, but Evelyn had paid for that trust through years of surveillance, unanswered letters, and uncertainty. Marcus would receive therapy because stolen funds were being restored to patients, not because a billionaire had rescued him. She asked the public to remember that corruption rarely survives through one powerful villain alone. It survives because ordinary institutions make exhausted people prove their suffering repeatedly, while influential people are believed without evidence. The statement spread farther than the gala photographs ever had, turning Evelyn from a mysterious woman beside Benjamin into the moral center of the investigation. Richard was charged with financial fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, evidence tampering, and obstruction, while several former executives negotiated cooperation agreements. The legal process took months rather than ending with a single dramatic confession, and Ethan attended every hearing without using private entrances. Some investors blamed him for the company's temporary decline, although employees whose pensions were protected began sending letters that complicated the public narrative. They did not praise Benjamin's silence, but many understood the fear behind it, because they had also postponed difficult truths while trying to protect their families. Ethan read those letters beside Amara at the Brooks apartment, where Marcus continued therapy and gradually regained enough strength to walk short distances with forearm crutches. Progress remained slow, painful, and expensive, yet it no longer depended upon Amara accepting invisible sacrifices as the price of being responsible. The Caldwell estate converted Benjamin's private study into an independent archive documenting the fraud, the recovery plan, and Evelyn's role, with every exhibit reviewed by historians from outside the family. Amara refused a ceremonial title, although she accepted leadership of a new patient advocacy council only after confirming that its budget and authority could not be withdrawn by future executives. She insisted that every denial of essential rehabilitation receive human review, plain language explanation, and an appeal process that did not punish families for lacking lawyers. Marcus joined the council after completing an accessibility certification course, using the experience he once considered an interruption to design better systems for others. Daniel returned to work under the restructuring officer, although he began teaching younger employees that loyalty to a leader never excused silence about harm. The reforms did not erase what happened, but they transformed memory from a polished family possession into a public responsibility. Ethan spent nearly a year outside executive leadership, advising small businesses, attending governance hearings, and learning how much of his identity had depended upon being introduced before he entered a room. His friendship with Amara deepened slowly, without grand gifts or public declarations, because both understood that gratitude could easily imitate love when two people survived the same crisis. They argued about policy, laughed over Marcus's terrible coffee, and traveled to Bellwether to help Samuel restore the church roof, with funds recovered through the legal settlement. One evening beneath the stone arch where Evelyn had once stood beside Benjamin, Ethan admitted that he did not know whether he had become a better man or merely a man who finally lost the ability to avoid becoming one. Amara answered that character was rarely a permanent achievement. It was the choice people repeated when no audience remained. The board eventually invited Ethan to return as chief executive under strict governance reforms, and he accepted only after employees, patient representatives, and independent directors received permanent voting seats. He did not frame the return as redemption because redemption belonged to people who continued repairing harm after the headlines faded. On the anniversary of the Hawthorne Gala, Ethan attended the same charity event without entering through the private reception line. Amara arrived beside Marcus, who crossed the ballroom with a cane and refused assistance until the final polished step. When the orchestra began, Ethan handed Amara the restored watch, its hands moving beyond 9:17 for the first time in decades. She opened the back and found no hidden evidence, only a new engraving placed beneath Benjamin's faded initials. Truth is not what we inherit, it is what we choose to carry. Amara closed the watch and returned it to Ethan, explaining that her mother had completed the promise long before either of them understood its cost. The object no longer needed protection because the truth had been distributed among people who could challenge any future attempt to bury it. Ethan asked her to dance, not beneath the attention of photographers, but near the edge of the ballroom, where servers moved through the crowd and noticed what powerful guests often missed. Amara accepted, then smiled when Ethan glanced toward a young waiter, nearly struck by a careless donor, and stepped aside to steady his tray. The moment was small, unrecorded, and invisible to everyone who believed transformation required an audience. Amara saw it clearly, and Ethan understood that the most important judgment of his life had never come from a board, a courtroom, or a family name. It came from becoming the kind of man who acted differently when no one important appeared to be watching.